The 1950s in America were an age of optimism wrapped in chrome and neon, but also a time of contradictions, where science, risk, and wonder often blended into everyday life. It was a decade where the future seemed both thrilling and terrifying, and where ordinary people lived at the crossroads of tradition and transformation. Take Las Vegas, for instance. In most cities, alarm clocks woke people for breakfast. But in Vegas, the dawn wake-up call could be an atomic bomb. Just outside the city, nuclear tests were staged in the desert, and instead of running for cover, tourists grabbed binoculars. Before the sun rose, hotel guests climbed to rooftops and desert ridges to watch mushroom clouds bloom against the horizon. To them, it wasn't destruction, it was a spectacle, a fireworks show for the atomic age. Casinos jumped on the craze, serving atomic cocktails at rooftop bars, selling postcards of mushroom clouds, and hosting viewing parties complete with themed decor. In a strange twist of history, nuclear blasts became both a tourist attraction and a marketing gimmick. Today, the very thought seems surreal, but to the 1950s mind, it was a glimpse of tomorrow. Across the Mojave Desert, Los Angeles faced a different cloud: smog. The 1950s cemented the city's reputation as the smog capital of America. What began as an unexplained haze in 1943, one that sent frightened residents scrambling and speculating about poison gas attacks, had by the 50s become part of daily life. The thick brown blanket of pollution irritated eyes, burned lungs, and turned blue skies into a gray soup. Children stayed indoors during smog alerts, while drivers crept forward with headlights on at noon. Smog was no longer mysterious, but it was no less dangerous. And yet, life continued. People accepted the choking air as just another price of progress in a booming post-war city. Progress had another form: the interstate highway system. Launched in 1956, it promised to connect America like never before. With wide, straight lanes and endless pavement, it turned cross-country journeys into family adventures. Roadside motels, diners, and billboards sprang up as ribbons of asphalt stitched the nation together. But for every gleaming highway built, entire communities were erased. Working-class neighborhoods, often minority, were leveled to make way for overpasses and cloverleafs. Families watched bulldozers tear through front yards, while city maps were redrawn with little regard for those displaced. For some, the new highways represented freedom. For others, they represented loss. Still, cars themselves defined the decade. They weren't just machines, they were statements. Sleek, shiny, and futuristic, with tail fins that looked ready for takeoff, cars turned driveways into showcases of prosperity. Families didn't just own cars, they tended to them like prized possessions. Weekends meant washing, waxing, and buffing chrome until hoods gleamed like mirrors. A spotless car parked in front of a modest home symbolized not just ownership, but arrival, a ticket to the middle class and the American dream. Filling up at the pump was an experience all its own. Gas cost just 20 cents a gallon, roughly $2 in today's terms, but what you really paid for was service. Attendants in crisp uniforms appeared the moment you rolled up. They pumped your gas, checked your oil, aired your tires, and wiped down your windshield, all while calling you sir or ma'am with a friendly smile. This wasn't self-service, it was full service, woven into the rhythm of the road. But not every mode of transportation gleamed with comfort. In New York, the subway system carried millions daily, and in the 1950s, the rides were often stifling. Air conditioning was still years away, so commuters relied on ceiling fans whirring overhead and open windows that blasted hot city air into crowded cars. In the sweltering summer, men loosened ties, women fanned themselves with folded newspapers, and everyone endured until cooled trains finally appeared in the next decade. Meanwhile, in the suburbs, another kind of vehicle rolled down quiet streets: the DDT truck. It looked like a parade float for modern science, spraying clouds of pesticide into the air. Children on bicycles followed the mist like it was a magical fog machine, laughing as they pedaled through the chemical haze. Parents waved from porches, reassured that science was keeping mosquitoes and disease at bay. No warnings, no masks, no second thoughts. To them, this was safety, not risk. And then, every December, cities and towns reminded Americans that magic wasn't only scientific, it was seasonal. Department stores transformed their front windows into theaters of wonder. Toy trains circled miniature villages, tiny elves hammered away in glowing workshops, and dollhouses twinkled with strings of lights. Parents hoisted children up for a closer look, while crowds pressed against frosted glass, marveling at scenes that signaled the true arrival of the holidays. For many families, the Christmas windows were as much a tradition as the tree at home. But the decade wasn't only about wonder. It was about bold, sometimes bizarre ambition. Operation Plowshare, a government project launched in the 50s, proposed using hydrogen bombs for construction. Why bother digging a canal when you could blast one open with nuclear power? Why carve highways with bulldozers when atomic fire could reshape mountains? To modern ears, it sounds like science fiction gone mad. Yet at the time, it was pitched as visionary, proof that the same weapons of war could build a better tomorrow. Of course, the looming shadow of the Cold War made Americans cautious too. Fallout shelters became a quiet obsession. Families stocked basements with canned beans, flashlights, and transistor radios. Some poured concrete bunkers in backyards, turning them into survival pods. Others simply tucked supplies between laundry machines and furnaces, hoping that in the event of nuclear war, survival could be improvised. These shelters were less about comfort and more about reassurance, a fragile attempt to feel in control in an age of global tension. And above ground, life went on, ordinary, dangerous, thrilling, all at once. San Francisco's cable cars clattered through foggy streets, bells ringing, tourists dangling off wooden sides, and locals gripping tightly as cars tilted around steep hills. It was both daily commute and adventure ride. This was America in the 1950s, a place where mushroom clouds were entertainment, smog was accepted, highways tore cities apart while uniting a nation, and cars symbolized freedom on four wheels. It was a decade where optimism glowed brightly, even when shadows loomed close behind. The 1950s were a decade when everyday life felt both ordinary and extraordinary, when danger blended seamlessly with routine and innovation became ritual. Consider the highways again. By the middle of the decade, America was not only a nation of drivers, it was a nation built around cars. The automobile wasn't just freedom, it was identity. And yet, behind the polished chrome and Sunday drives lurked risks we barely consider today. Traffic deaths in the 1950s were shockingly high. Seatbelts were optional at best, airbags were science fiction, and cars lacked crumple zones to soften impact. Families piled into Chevrolets and Fords with children bouncing freely in the back seat, dogs sprawled across laps, and luggage stacked high without straps. Accidents were often fatal, but the open road called, and few could resist the promise of speed with the radio blaring and the wind in their hair. Las Vegas, that glittering desert oasis, wasn't just about mushroom clouds and casinos, it was also a city of quirks. With only about 25,000 residents in 1950, gambling wasn't limited to the Strip. Slot machines appeared everywhere, in grocery stores, gas stations, even tucked into the corners of laundromats. Housewives dropping by for bread might slip a nickel into a one-armed bandit. For a brief window, gambling was woven into the fabric of daily life, until Nevada lawmakers banned non-casino slots in 1955, reining in the freewheeling experiment. Car culture, too, had its oddities. Car keys weren't unique. One Chevrolet key might start another by accident. Stories circulated of strangers driving off in the wrong car, only to realize their mistake blocks later. To protect their new investments, some owners fitted their cars with clear plastic seat covers. They preserved upholstery, but came with a price. In summer, they stuck to bare skin, and in winter, they squeaked with every move. Nobody loved them, but comfort often gave way to preserving value. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the government was experimenting in ways most Americans would never know. The CIA launched MK Ultra, a secret Cold War program that tested LSD on soldiers, prisoners, and even unsuspecting civilians. The goal? To explore mind control and interrogation tactics. The experiments often lacked consent and left scars that wouldn't fully come to light until decades later. It was a reminder that beneath the polished facade of the 1950s, darker currents flowed. Detroit, however, roared with optimism. Known as the arsenal of democracy during World War II, its auto factories continued churning out prosperity. A factory job meant security, a house, a car, savings, and a future for the family. Assembly lines hummed, paychecks stretched, and the middle class grew. For many, Detroit embodied the American dream. But not all habits of the era were as bright. Cigarette smoking was everywhere, in homes, offices, restaurants, even hospitals. Doctors themselves appeared in advertisements recommending certain brands as smoother or healthier. Over half of American men smoked daily, often without pause, leaving a haze in every closed room. And cigarettes weren't the only vice wrapped in respectability. Amphetamines, marketed as pep pills or diet aids, found their way into medicine cabinets. Housewives took them to power through chores, businessmen to extend workdays. They promised energy and weight loss, but carried risks of addiction that few recognized at the time. Science seemed to deliver shortcuts to stamina, and people trusted it. Far to the south, Miami's suburbs were spreading across drained swamps. Developers carved canals, sold pastel-colored homes, and advertised sunny paradise living. Families traded alligators and marshland for palm trees and cul-de-sacs. Hurricanes still threatened, mosquitoes still swarmed, but the dream of affordable housing under bright skies outweighed the risks. Yet even in paradise, women faced barriers. In the 1950s, a married woman often needed her husband's signature to secure a mortgage or credit card. It wasn't written into law, but was practiced widely by banks and businesses. Financial independence for women was discouraged, if not denied outright. It would take decades, until the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, for the rule to be erased. Religion, too, left its stamp on public life. In 1954, the words "under God" were added to the Pledge of Allegiance, reinforcing Cold War patriotism with divine language. 2 years later, "In God We Trust" became the official national motto, replacing E Pluribus Unum. Classroom prayers and Bible readings were standard in many schools, seen not as controversial, but as part of moral education. To the modern ear, these practices sparked debates over church and state. To the 1950s family, they felt normal. Urban rhythms carried their own peculiarities. Apartment buildings often had basement incinerators for trash disposal. Each day, smoke rose from chimneys as refuse burned, leaving cities blanketed in soot that no one thought twice about. Meanwhile, modern atomic gadgets filled homes. Glow-in-the-dark watches painted with radium, orange Fiesta dinnerware tinted with uranium, even uranium glass that shimmered under ultraviolet light. People handled them daily, admiring their novelty without realizing the risks. Healthcare itself reflected an intimacy lost today. Doctors made house calls, carrying small black bags filled with stethoscopes, syringes, and handwritten charts. Payment was simple: An envelope of cash, no insurance forms, no billing departments. Trust was personal, malpractice suits rare, and medicine came to your door. And beyond the comforts of home, patriotism found its place on rooftops and in towers. The Ground Observer Corps, a volunteer program, recruited teachers, retirees, even children to scan the skies for enemy aircraft. With binoculars in hand, they kept watch, feeling a sense of purpose as Cold War tension demanded vigilance. Meanwhile, in the skies themselves, air travel carried its own mystique. Cabins were smoky from cigarettes, noisy from engines, and prone to turbulence that rattled coffee trays. Yet flying felt glamorous. Passengers dressed in their best clothes, stewardesses served with poise, and the very act of soaring above the clouds carried prestige, even if the seats were thin and the ride was bumpy. The GI Bill continued to reshape the landscape. Subdivisions like Levittown sprouted seemingly overnight, row after row of affordable homes for veterans. Prefabricated houses lingered from the 1940s, but the new suburban model offered space, lawns, and the sense of permanence that defined the dream of post-war America. The 1950s were full of bold leaps and blind spots. Families chased freedom on highways without seatbelts. Women built homes but were denied credit. Doctors lit cigarettes between house calls, and neighbors waved at planes in the sky, uncertain if they carried travelers or threats. It was a world balancing on the edge of confidence and caution, where faith in progress was unshakable, even when progress carried hidden costs. By the closing years of the 1950s, America had become a nation caught between the comfort of the familiar and the pull of the unknown. It was an era of contradictions, ordinary in its routines, extraordinary in its transformations. On the streets, one of the most visible symbols of change was the polio vaccine. Parents lined up their children in school gyms, grateful for Jonas Salk's discovery. For years, the fear of paralysis haunted neighborhoods every summer, with swimming pools closed and gatherings canceled. Now, a tiny needle, or later, a sugar cube, brought protection. It was one of science's triumphs, cementing a sense that modern medicine could conquer anything. Yet even as diseases were pushed back, new dangers filled homes. Lead paint coated nursery walls. Asbestos lined schools and offices, and DDT was sprayed liberally across suburban lawns to kill mosquitoes. The air smelled fresh, the grass stayed green, and pests disappeared, but unseen toxins lingered. What seems like progress often carried invisible costs deferred to the future. The Cold War touched nearly every aspect of daily life. Families practiced duck-and-cover drills under school desks, children covering their heads as if thin wood could shield them from a nuclear blast. Neighborhoods built backyard bomb shelters, stocked with canned food, flashlights, and board games. Magazines advertised fallout shelters alongside refrigerators, treating survival as another consumer choice. The atomic age wasn't just science, it was salesmanship. Television, meanwhile, had become the hearth of the American home. From black and white sets came variety shows, sitcoms, and evening news reports that shaped national imagination. Families gathered for I Love Lucy, The Honeymooners, or westerns that painted simple morality tales. Advertisers seized the moment, embedding jingles into memory, selling soap, cars, and soft drinks through catchy tunes. For the first time, the same stories and products entered living rooms coast to coast, binding strangers into a shared culture. Music added its own revolution. The crooners of the early decade, Perry Como, Dean Martin, gave way to rock and roll. Elvis Presley's hips scandalized parents, but electrified teenagers. Record players spun in basements, soda shops filled with jukeboxes, and youth culture carved its own identity. Rebellion had a rhythm, and for many, it was the first taste of independence from their parents' world. But even sports reflected the shifting tides. Baseball, America's pastime, had already begun integrating with Jackie Robinson in 1947, but by the 1950s, black athletes were reshaping leagues despite discrimination. The nation was slowly, unevenly, confronting its contradictions between equality and segregation. Race relations, in fact, defined the decade's greatest tensions. The Brown v. Board of Education ruling in 1954 declared segregated schools unconstitutional, igniting struggles across the South. Images of the Little Rock Nine, walking stoically through mobs of protesters, became symbols of courage. While suburbia promised comfort, millions of Americans lived within boundaries set by redlining, discrimination, and Jim Crow. The American dream was advertised as universal, but delivered unevenly. And yet, optimism endured. Families flocked to Disneyland after its 1955 opening in Anaheim, California. It wasn't just an amusement park, it was a vision of tomorrow, with Tomorrowland showcasing rocket ships and futuristic homes. Walt Disney's creation embodied the era's belief that imagination, technology, and determination could build a brighter future. Space, after all, was the new frontier. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, Americans looked skyward with awe and anxiety. Suddenly, the race wasn't just about cars or consumer goods, it was about orbits and rockets. Schools emphasized science and math, television broadcast space updates, and children played astronaut in backyards. The future no longer lay across the highway or in the suburbs, it was among the stars. At the same time, the kitchen remained the stage for everyday transformation. Frozen dinners, Tupperware parties, and electric appliances promised efficiency and modernity. Advertisements showed smiling women holding gleaming mixers and microwaves, promising more time for family. But those same ads reinforced strict gender roles, where women were expected to embody perfection. Housekeeper, cook, mother, and beauty queen, all at once. The pressure was heavy, but the glossy surface rarely cracked in public. Religion and ritual tied families together. Sundays were for church, dinners were for family, and holidays were celebrated with rituals that blended tradition with consumerism. Christmas trees sparkled with electric lights, while television specials turned holidays into spectacles. Thanksgiving dinners stretched tables, while 4th of July parades mixed patriotism with pageantry. But the youth of the 1950s were restless. Cars became more than transportation, they were freedom machines. Teenagers gathered at drive-ins, raced along highways, and turned back seats into private worlds. Leather jackets, bobby socks, and poodle skirts became symbols of identity. Where adults saw rebellion, teens saw self-expression. But beyond the charm and style, the world was shifting toward challenges that would explode in the 1960s. Civil rights, feminism, environmental awareness, and anti-war protests all had roots in the contradictions of the 1950s. A decade remembered as simple was in reality laying the groundwork for upheaval. Even its infrastructure was symbolic. The Interstate Highway Act of 1956 stitched together thousands of miles of road, connecting cities like never before. But while highways built connections, they also carved through neighborhoods, displacing communities, often poor or minority ones. Progress always came with trade-offs. And in those trade-offs, the truth of the 1950s emerges. It was a decade of dazzling surfaces, shiny cars, new suburbs, glowing televisions. But beneath those surfaces were struggles and questions. Who was included in the dream? Who was left behind? What costs were hidden beneath promises of convenience? Looking back, the 1950s seem like a simpler time. But simplicity is always an illusion. It was a world of cigarette smoke and rocket dreams, of chrome and conformity, of fear and faith. A world where families watched mushroom clouds for fun, then tucked children into bed with lullabies. A world where optimism soared higher than airplanes, but shadows always lingered at the edges. The 1950s weren't just history, they were a stage where America rehearsed for its future, carrying forward both its triumphs and its contradictions. And as we revisit that decade today, we see not just nostalgia, but the roots of everything that came after.